Hi, my name's Natasha, this is FEA History, and today we're going to be talking about the one, the only, Henry VIII, and we're going to be delving into what he was really like. Or in other words, was Henry VIII actually a dick? Now, one of my favourite things about Henry VIII is kind of everyone knows at least a little something about him, so we don't really have to lay out too much groundwork before we get started. Pretty much everyone knows that he was a greedy man for many things, but especially for love, going on to marry 6 wives, 2 of whom he had beheaded. Partly because he was mad keen on getting a son. I have a son! And Henry was petty and also really cruel. He'd execute people who'd once been his best friends and even closest advisors. Plus he was ruthless when his subjects disobeyed him. Oh, and there was that one time that he wanted a divorce and the Catholic Church said that he couldn't have a divorce, so he broke away from the church, built an entirely new church, also he could just have a divorce. Yeah, standard breakup behaviour, we've all been there. Okay, so when we put all of that together, we get a picture of Henry VIII as a textbook tyrant. And that's kind of right, but it's also more complicated than that because this is history and so of course it is. Which is why when we look at Henry VIII, it's really a game of 2 halves. The young Henry and the old Henry. Both have incredibly different personalities and the reason for that is actually really fascinating. Henry VIII was never meant to be king. He was second in line behind his brother Arthur, and it was Arthur that was prepped to rule while Henry wasn't. In fact, the young Prince Henry was very similar to the Prince Harry that we have today, the hot younger brother. He was 6'2", muscular, ginger, he loved sports, he loved to party, he was really charismatic, and so of course he was quickly one of the public's favourite royals. But then things changed in 1502 when Arthur died unexpectedly. Henry was next in line and he came to the throne a few years later in 1509. Sure, the new King Henry was a teenager, but people were really excited for his reign, and not only just because the public liked him in general. People were still recovering from the War of the Roses, and Henry promised to be a pretty peaceful ruler overall. Plus, he was confident, kind, and if needed, he would be able to step in and protect the country. Pretty much the whole princely package. Even in his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he excelled. Though she was his brother's widow, he married her and the pair became a power couple. Seriously, Catherine and Henry were total couple goals. They were in love, had each other's backs, and were a king and a queen that the country were properly enamoured by. So what changed? How do we get from this young Henry to the tyrant that we think of today? Well, it could all just come down to an accident. In January 1536, the now 44-year-old Henry VIII was jousting, something he loved to do, when he was thrown off his horse in full armour and his horse, which was also in armour, fell on him. This was a serious accident and people assumed that Henry would die. He was actually unconscious for about 2 hours and suffered a leg injury that would stay with him for the rest of his life. But he survived. Still, it was a traumatic event, one that was made worse by the fact that his then wife Anne Boleyn miscarried the couple's baby, a boy, as a result of shock from the accident. All of that is incredibly tragic, but how would that actually impact Henry VIII's personality long term? Well, there is actually a theory. In 2016, scientists from Yale University published a study that suggested that Henry VIII actually suffered a traumatic brain injury from the accident, as well as CTE, and that's something several other later studies have also backed up. Now, CTE might sound familiar, and that's because it's a condition that many American footballers have been diagnosed with. It's a progressive brain condition caused by repeated blows to the head, which makes sense in the case of Henry VIII, because the 1536 accident wasn't the first time he'd had a blow to his head, it was just the worst. Patients with CTE have been noted to have explosive outbursts, prolonged periods of rage, dramatic personality changes, and there have even been examples of CTE patients committing murder. Then there are the symptoms of anxiety, memory loss and confusion, all of which Henry VIII exhibited after this accident. And the CTE theory in particular does really make sense, because it's after 1536 that we really start to see this tyrannical behaviour from him. For example, of his 5 wives after this time, Anne Boleyn is beheaded, Anne of Cleves just about escapes that fate, Catherine Howard is beheaded, and Catherine Parr comes dangerously close. In 1646, guards actually turned up to take Catherine Parr to the Tower of London, only to be met by Henry VIII shouting at them to go away. And this wasn't him gallantly defending his wife. This was him forgetting to tell the guards that he'd actually forgiven her the day before and he no longer wanted her dead. Memory loss and rage in one fell swoop. Then there was the paranoia and anxiety. By the time Henry VIII died, he'd had multiple people that were once close to him executed because of this. You literally just needed to pop a conspiracy theory in front of him and he'd be like, yeah, totally believe that, tight, who do I need to kill? And then of course there's the rumours of impotence. This was raised by George Boleyn in his trial during his sister Anne's downfall. It was a rumour that persisted about Henry for years and is yet another symptom of CTE. Of course, this is just a theory. We can't magic up Henry's brain and check, but it is a theory that multiple historians like Lucy Worsley and Robert Hutchinson do agree with. However, you may have noticed that this all begins in 1536. And if you're up on your Tudor history, you know that Henry VIII wasn't exactly a saint before then. By 1536, Henry had already broken off from the Catholic Church, was well on his way to starting to brutally dissolve Britain's monasteries, trumped up treason charges to execute his former mentor Thomas More, and exiled his first wife and former great love, Catherine of Aragon. How do you explain that? Well, there is of course the idea that the CTE and the traumatic brain injury were bubbling away before 1536, but then there's also a much more kind of emotional answer to that. Young Henry was never supposed to be king, and that's a job people are literally bred for, especially in a time when a king is legitimately ruling a country. Henry tried really hard and he was, for the most part, a pretty decent king, but there is always going to be an impact that having all this power thrust upon you is going to have. There's a reason that they say absolute power corrupts absolutely. If you trace his reign, you can see his ego grow, his desire for power grow, and his desperate want for a legacy to take him over completely. Then when we factor in things that came further down the road, like the CTE, the pain that he was living in every day thanks to the leg injury he got in that accident, and also the possibility that later in life he lived with undiagnosed diabetes, it's kind of easy to see how this young man progressively turned into a tyrant. So there you have it. Was Henry VIII a dick? Yeah. But the reason behind it is absolutely fascinating and a great example of what can be done when we mix history and modern science. But what do you think? Is there any credence behind this theory, or was Henry VIII a man just acting within his time? I'd love to know what you think. Please do remember to like and subscribe and to share this video if you enjoyed it. It's a really, really great way to help us build up a little bit more. If you're interested in more history goodness, then you can find links in the doobly-doo to all our social media as well as our website, f8history.com. See you next week. Bye!